All right, one of the ages of reform is what we're going to focus on next, and this is a time in American history when people were working together to try and make changes to how America worked for the better. And so we need to look at this word reform and we need to define it. And so social reform is, and I wrote it down here, it's right there in front of you, an organized attempt or organized attempts to improve conditions of life. And so basically, how do I put that in middle school words? It's a group of people that are coming together in a planned way to try and make life better for everybody. Okay. And there were a lot of different reasons that people did this, but the first one we're going to talk about is political reasons. And we realized that we're trying, especially with like Andrew Jackson and stuff like that, we're trying to get more people involved in the government and more people to be able to vote. And so we needed to make the process more fair. And so basically what we did is we allowed more white men to be allowed to vote. At this time, that was what it meant to be more fair. And so the rules that changed are, first off, as long as you're white, you don't have to own property to be able to vote. So that allowed it so, poorer white people were allowed to vote, or white men. The second thing is basically anybody is allowed to, as long as you're white and a man, is allowed to vote or to hold office. So to become a representative or to become a senator or something like that. And some people even started to support women's rights to to vote and to do all of these things. It wasn't a whole lot of people at the time, but some people really started to build this up. And the last thing that was happening in the political arena was there were so many people that were starting to become anti-slavery. And one of the quotes that I really liked from this time was, "No society that allowed one human being to own another can call itself a democracy." You just can't. You can't call yourself a democracy where the people are in charge if you're letting people own other people because they don't even have a right over themselves, much less the government. And so a lot of people thought slavery just needed to be completely eliminated. Another reason that we started to make some of these changes was for religious reasons. Okay, and the religious reasons that were happening was called the Second Great Awakening. And so it was this idea with Christianity, at least, and with the religions that were happening at the time in America, that before the Second Great Awakening, they believed in something called predestination. So this is before it happened. This is what they were trying to change. And so predestination was an idea that basically God decided if you were a good person or a bad person before you were even born. Okay, so no matter what, you can't change it. You are either good or you are bad. You are either going to heaven or you are going to hell, and there's nothing you can do to change it. And then the Second Great Awakening happened, and now people started to they started to talk about that you can change, that your actions can make you a good person or a bad person. And even if you've been a bad person, you can change that in and change yourself into being a good person through your actions. Okay, and one of the people that started to really preach this was this man up on the top. His name is Charles Finney. I know he's a really intense looking dude, almost scary in a way, but really he was a man that was out there holding these religious revivals. And a revival is like an enormous religious meeting that is so big that it had to be held outdoors because no building could contain it. There were just too many people there. And so he would speak about this idea that you decide if you are good. Okay, you can make changes in your life. You can follow the morality and principles that should be happening. And so he urged people to change their lives, right? Stop drinking, stop gambling, stop doing these bad things. So now we know the political motivations and the religious motivations for these movements. Let's start talking about the movements themselves. Okay, the temperance movement is the first one, and the temperance movement is not something we hear very often because we hear of prohibition and things like that. But what is temperance? Temperance was an organized effort to end alcohol abuse and all the problems that were created by it. So people are drinking too much alcohol. We need to find a way to stop that, and we need to do it in an organized way. And a lot of the people were women who were in the temperance movement at this time. This is one of their first forays, their first explorations into politics. And so the big problem at the time, the reason alcohol was such a big problem is because whiskey, which is a very strong alcohol, very high proof, very alcoholic, was safer and cheaper to drink than most things. So it was milk was safe to drink and beer was safe to drink, but both of those were way more expensive than whiskey. You could get whiskey for a lot cheaper, and so people bought the cheaper thing because they couldn't afford milk and beer. And then to drink water, which is free, right? It was unsafe. A lot of it was unsafe because at this time it was being polluted heavily by factories and by people looking for gold and all that kind of stuff. And so alcoholism, people being, always drunk and very, very drunk and to where it was affecting their health and their family and things like that became really, really big. Okay. And most of the people that were involved, like I said, in the temperance movement were women. Okay. Some of them wanted moderation. Some of them wanted prohibition. So what's the difference between moderation and prohibition? Moderation is trying to get rid of the strong drink, trying to get rid of whiskey. You don't want that really, really strong drink. You can still have some beer, you can still drink in moderation, but we don't want that strong drink to be around. Prohibition, they just wanted to get rid of all alcohol, period. That's it. Okay. And alcohol was a big problem because men were getting drunk and they were coming home and sometimes not coming home, but they would come home and they would be abusive to their wives and children. Sometimes they would not come home. It was not uncommon that on Fridays they would get their paycheck, then they'd go to the bar and drink away their entire paycheck before they even came home because they were so addicted to alcohol. The next movement was a movement to reform and to change prisons because prisons were extremely harsh areas. There was no heat in these areas, no furniture, not enough food in these cramped rooms, too many people pushed into these buildings, okay, and really, really big issues. And even worse was the people that were mentally ill because the mentally ill people, they were pushed into the same area as the prisons. They might not have even done a crime, but because they were mentally ill and couldn't control themselves, people would say they're crazy, right? They were put into these prisons, and oftentimes they would be chained up. There's pictures from that time of people with it looks like a bird cage around their head so that they didn't bite people. I mean, it was like a dungeon. It felt like a dungeon when you look at those pictures. Okay, and a lot of the other people that were in there, they didn't do a crime either. They just owed other people money, so they were called debtors. Okay, and debtors are people that just you owe someone else money, you can't pay it back, and so they put those people into prison. Okay, and this woman right here, Dorothea Dix, she was a school teacher, but she fought and led the prison reform movement for more humane prisons to try and help out and make the prisons better. Now, eventually, she did win it. They did rebuild safer prisons. They did make laws where they wouldn't put people that just owed other people money. They wouldn't put those people in prisons, but that would take an amount or some time. However, during this age of reform, Dorothea Dix was fighting that fight. The next type of reforming was education reform. And education reform was really needed because there was only one state in the entire country, Massachusetts, where they required school, where everybody had to go to school, and everybody was given the opportunity to go to school. In all of the other states, it was basically only the rich people could afford to pay for education. Okay, and so the poor people, they got nothing. All that they learned at home. But if they're poor people, then their parents didn't get any education either. So a lot of these people were not able to read or write. The literacy rate was very, very low in America at this time. Okay, and so we realized that if we're going to have all these new people voting, these poor people, we're going to allow them to vote, then we really need to make education bigger so that they can become part of the voting process and understand it, be able to read newspaper articles and talk intelligently. And so, not only that, but we also thought that if we educate the new people, then the immigrants that are coming in that are of low education and are poor, it will help them to become more of a part of our country too. and not feel like outsiders that, can only speak another language and things like that, kind of get them to be part of the country. And so the man who fought for education reform was Horace Mann, and he fought really, really hard for free public schools. He wanted them everywhere, and eventually he won that fight because we have public schools all the way across America now. The other thing that he did is he fought to improve the quality of American schooling, make it better. Okay, and so this is where I always have whoever wants to come up and they can give a big hug to Horace Mann on the screen, but you can't do that. But you can hug your phone or your computer or whatever you're watching if you really like it. Because what he did is he set up colleges so that you could train the teachers better. He increased the amount of money that teachers made so that they could be better, so they could get better people in there to be able to do it. And this is the one you're really going to like. He made it so that the school year was much longer. Instead of having like 6 months of school and then 6 months of break, instead of that, he decided that maybe in order to keep and educate the kids as much as possible, you needed to keep them for maybe 9 or 10 months and have that break be 2 or 3 months at most. So I can tell you're all very, very happy that Horace Mann did this fight. Okay, some of the other people, not necessarily Horace Mann, but some other people also wanted to push to educate these African Americans, these slaves, but at this time it was really kind of a crazy thought. There was there wasn't a big push to start educating these people and get them to read. The anti-slavery movement is the next reform movement that we are going to talk about, and it really goes all the way back, and a lot of people are starting to get upset about slavery, and they said it goes all the way back to the Declaration of Independence, which was our first official document as a country, and it said that all men are created equal. And so if we have our very first document saying all men are created equal, and we're treating these African Americans as property and making them do whatever we want, and otherwise killing or torturing, whipping them, like that doesn't fit well with the Declaration of Independence. So a lot of people were upset about it, and so over time, the first 30 or 40 years of our country, every northern state had either gotten rid of slavery completely or they had pledged to. They had said, in this year, we will be getting rid of slavery. And so in 1817, one of the very first big movements to end slavery came through, and it was called the colonization movement of 1817. And it basically said we should free all of the slaves, and then we should send them to this little red country right there in Africa, where we're going to make a colony called Liberia. Okay, and it basically said on this west coast of Africa, we're going to set up a colony, we're going to send all the slaves back so that they can be back in their home continent. However, it failed, and it failed because really most of them did not want to leave. Okay, it only ended up being like 1,400 people total, which is only 2 times the amount of people that go to Higher Ground Academy. It only ended up being 1,400 people that did it at all, because they had been in America for generations. They weren't the first people that were just taken out of Africa and brought into America. No, it was their kids or their grandkids or maybe their great-great-grandkids of the people who had been captured in Africa and brought over. And so they didn't even know what Africa looked like. They didn't know what Africa was like. All they knew was America. They didn't want to move away from a place that was their home that they knew about into this strange land, right? Africa was a strange land to them. And so even though the people were trying to do the right thing and allow the Africans to go back, it ended up failing because they didn't want to go back. They wanted to be here. This was their home. And so the groups after that wanted to end slavery and the people were known as abolitionists. Okay, and really, really, really important, the most important word in this definition of abolitionists, of reformers who wanted to end slavery now. Sure, it was important they wanted to end slavery, but lots of people wanted to end slavery. The abolitionists did not want to wait around. The most important word that you cannot forget when you're defining it is now. Okay, they wanted slavery to be over, and they wanted slavery to be over right now. Not next Tuesday, not next year, not in the year 1850. They want it over right now. Okay, and one of these men was William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison was a Quaker, and so he never did believe in slavery, but he also, Quakers are anti-violent, and so they are against violence, and so he wanted to do this in a peaceful way. But he wanted not just no slavery, he wanted full rights, the ability to be president, the ability to vote, the ability to do anything a white man could do for African Americans. Okay, and so he created the Liberator, and the Liberator was a newspaper, an anti-slavery publication, another word for basically a newspaper, a journal or something, and he created it and edited it throughout his entire life, and ended up that this Liberator lasted 34 years, and it only ended when slavery itself ended. So this went all the way through the Civil War. Another man who was an abolitionist was David Walker. As you can see, he's an African American man, and he wrote a book called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, and he said that slavery needs to be done. Okay, it's over. It needs to be done with, but that if we need to, then the slaves should rebel, and they should fight against and kill their white owners if they have to make slavery end. Okay, so any means necessary, he wanted slavery to end. Frederick Douglass was another abolitionist. He's the man on top here. Okay, and Frederick Douglass was a slave. He was born into slavery. Okay, and while he was a slave, broke the rules, and he learned to read, and then he learned to write and speak, and he was just a very, very gifted person, a gifted speaker and writer. And so he escaped to the north, and when he escaped to the north, he was asked to share his experiences with crowds. He would share what happened to him and what his life was like, so that more people would be against slavery because they understood how bad it was. And in one of his speeches, he said, "I appear this evening as a thief and a robber." I mean, that's a good way to get people's attention, right? I'm a thief and a robber. I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and I ran off with them. Basically saying, you're looking at me, you're thinking I'm a person? No, I'm a thief. I stole myself. I was owned by somebody else, and I stole myself and ran away. Okay, and so it's kind of crazy. It really got a lot of people to look at slavery and think, man, this is terrible. These people are not being treated like people. One of the leading abolitionists in the entire world was a former president. His name John Quincy Adams. Okay, sixth president of the U.S., but also a huge abolitionist. And so, after being the president, when he was a senator, he proposed an amendment that said no new states that come in should ever be slave states. We need to get rid of slavery eventually. Okay, now this amendment failed, but he did propose it. That was kind of his idea, what he thought should be happening. And he also was a lawyer that fought for the men of the Amistad. The Amistad is a slave ship that was headed over to America, and the slaves on board rebelled and killed the captain, and they said to the crew, you need to sail us back to Africa right now, okay, or we're going to kill you. And the crew turned around, but of course the African Americans, the slaves, didn't know which way was Africa. They're out in the middle of the ocean. They'd never been there before. And so the crew actually sailed to America instead. And when they sailed to America, all of the slaves were captured. And so this man tried to defend, John Quincy Adams defended the people from the Amistad and wanted them freed. And he spoke to the Supreme Court for 9 hours. He was a 73-year-old man that spent 9 hours fighting for these men in the Supreme Court to say, you need to please set the men from the Amistad free. Another organization was called the Underground Railroad. Now, the Underground Railroad was not underground, and it was not a railroad. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing because you may think of trains like a subway system that were underground moving slaves around, but it's not. It was just a secret group of people that helped slaves to escape to freedom, to free areas like the North and to Canada and things like that. It was very illegal to be doing this and very dangerous. If you got caught by someone who was trying to find those slaves, they may kill you. Okay, they would definitely put you in jail if you got caught, even by the police. Okay, because it was illegal to do this because you're stealing property from somebody else. Okay, and so the people that helped the slaves were called conductors, and they led the fugitive slaves from one station to the next station. Now, were these big train stations? No, stations could be like a cave. It could be like a church that was anti-slavery and just let people stay there. Okay, it might be a small room in somebody's house, right? And so they led these fugitive slaves from one station to the next. Usually at night they moved so they wouldn't get caught, okay, and eventually to freedom in the North or into Canada. Harriet Tubman was one of the most famous ones, and she was, as you can see, she was a slave before, and she had escaped, and so then she turned into a conductor. She wanted to help out, and she ended up moving 300 fugitive slaves and never got a single one captured. And one of her tricks to not getting any of them captured is she always carried a gun with her. And sure, the gun was to protect her from anybody who would come after and try and take her life or the slave's life. But the other thing that she said to all of the slaves that she moved is she said, if you try to run away, if you try to turn around, I will shoot you and I will kill you. So she threatened the slaves that she was helping. Why would she do this? Because if those slaves got away, they would know her face, they would know all the stops, they could shut down the entire railroad. And so she said, if you get scared and you run away, you can be scared and try and run away, but let me tell you, you will die if you try and run away from me because I will shoot you. Okay, and that's how she had such a successful record. And people were really upset about this in the South, and so they put together money, and there was a $40,000 reward for her capture, okay, as she was moving these people to freedom in the North or in Canada. Okay, and so that's kind of the story of the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman. Women's rights in the late 1700s, early 1800s were very, very low. They were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to be on juries, to go to college, to get into certain professions. They couldn't do certain work. People really saw them as their place in the world was in the private world, in home. Okay, they shouldn't be out in the world, doing jobs and being active. And one of the rules that's just really crazy is if you were married, you weren't allowed to keep the money that you made working or your own stuff. You did not own anything. If you bought a piece of land, that belonged to your husband. If you bought a trunk of dresses, that belonged to your husband. It didn't matter. Absolutely everything that you owned, you didn't actually own. It was your husband's. Okay, and so there were many activists that were trying to fight against this. One of them was Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a slave, a former slave. She was illiterate. She could not read or write, but she could speak very well, and she gave inspirational speeches about getting rid of slavery, abolitionism, as well as giving women rights. Okay, Lucretia Mott is the second one, and Lucretia Mott she was a Quaker, and so being a Quaker, they had already given women rights, and so she had a lot of experience organizing events and public speaking and things like that, so she was kind of the main organizer behind the women's rights movements. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was another one who had gone with another woman and their husbands, and they had gone to a conference in London, an anti-slavery conference, and the people stopped her and the other woman at the door and said women were not allowed into this anti-slavery meeting. And that's when she realized this is a serious problem, and we need to organize ourselves and fight against this. And so the organization that they started off with was a convention, and it was called the Seneca Falls Convention. And it was a group of women who got together and demanded their rights. They actually wrote out a piece of paper that demanded their rights. Okay, and they said, we want the same rights as men. And so they started, or this was really the beginning, the very beginning of the women's rights movements. And they were really calling for the right to vote and the right to own their own property and all of these different rights. During the Seneca Falls Convention, Susan B. Anthony, who's right here, okay, joined the women's rights movement. And some of the things that she did, and what her story kind of is, she was unmarried, and so even though those other women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all of them who had a husband and kids and kind of had to stay around home, she didn't, and so she was able to work with them and learn all the things they needed to, and she could travel around and kind of get people on her side and talk to people and get more women involved and get men involved too in the movement. And so she started the NAWSA, which we'll talk about later, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was kind of the person that could move around, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton kind of drove it from home. She kind of stayed back in the office, right? And so she was one of the people who pushed the furthest to get pure property rights for women. And so by the time she was done, women were able to own their own things, even if they were married. The other things that the Seneca Falls Convention started was women's education reform, and it was like this freedom where there were new colleges allowed to train women and women alone, and it allowed these women to be educated enough to get into new job markets, like being teachers, being nurses, being doctors, lawyers, things like that.